How do we know when there is criticism that we should be listening to, whether it's
Yeah.
endogenously driven or exogenous, if someone else is giving us feedback, versus it being sort of this toxic, constantly beating ourselves up? How are we able to distinguish between those two?
Yeah, and I like to think about the difference between self-awareness and self-criticism. So self-criticism is beating yourself up every time you do something wrong, right? And that's something that has no positive effect on us. It actually activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight. It's like having a terrorist living inside your head, beating you up and constantly putting you in this sort of anxious space. But self-awareness is different. So self-awareness is knowing where you might be weaker, knowing where you might need some help or you might need some more learning or some more training. For example, I'm a research scientist, and my training in statistics was never what it should be. And so when I run a study, I know I can manage a team. I know I can design a good study. I know I can write up the study. I know I can get it published. But my statistics, I am self-aware that that's not my strength. And so I bring a statistician onto my team. And that's the difference between self-criticism and self-awareness.
Is sort of knowing where you're weak, but not beating yourself up for the fact that you might have a weakness or that you're not a perfect picture at all in all verticals of life.
Exactly. Do you want me to share a story around that?
I would love, yes, would love.
I share a story in the book about, having been hired to do this keynote on a Saturday morning. And I know I don't usually work on Saturdays. That's usually my family time. And I completely forgot about this keynote that had been planned for 6 months and was on my calendar. For some reason that morning, it slipped my mind. And I was at a park an hour away with my kids when I received a message on my phone that said, "Are you having trouble logging on?" And it was this devastating moment that I had let these people down, and we had been planning for so long, and I was the opening keynote. And so in that moment, I felt devastating shame. And I felt it for the rest of the morning, and then I went home and I recorded a talk. I sent it to them. I asked them to cancel my honorarium and so forth. But there was two ways I could go. I could go into that. Shame was there, and I felt it for a couple hours pretty intensely, and it was unpleasant. But I also, it stayed there. I didn't go into a negative cycle of, oh, you always do this, and beat myself up. I just didn't go there. So that's the difference. It's not that you don't go through hard times and hard emotions, but that you don't add fuel to the fire, because isn't the experience itself hard enough?
Right. So how do we begin to start deprogramming the self-loathing? I mean, you talk about in the book, and I'll just read a quick quote here. Self-loathing is such a widespread viral program. And I say viral because A, it's common, B, it's contagious, it's running in families and entire societies, and C, it's also destructive. So how are we able to become aware that there is this program that we have, and how do we start to deconstruct that? How do we start to deconstruct that self-loathing?
Yeah, awareness is the first step, because it's kind of like the fish that's swimming in water, and that's like, what's water? But a lot of the time, almost everyone has got the self-criticism, self-loathing program running in their minds, to the point where you just think it's normal. When everyone's doing something, you don't question it, right? Everyone drinks coffee. Why should I question that fact that we're drinking a drug for breakfast every morning, right? Like, we don't do that. So, and because it's like I said, when you are self-critical, and you speak to yourself in a certain way, you're going to soon hear your child speaking that way. And that's why you can decide the buck stops here. I know that's what happened for me. That was such an eye-opener. I was like, wow, my 5-year-old is speaking the way that I speak to myself? No, I don't want him to suffer that way for the rest of his life, right? So in that way, it's viral. In that way, it gets learned and picked up by children and gets passed on. So awareness is first, but then the second aspect is basically, and you've probably heard of self-compassion. There's been a lot of research on it, which is 3 things, which is 1, speaking to yourself the way you would to a friend, as opposed to the words that you usually say to yourself. It's remembering that emotions are to be aware of, but you're not adding fuel to the fire. And it's finally being aware that making mistakes is just a normal human part of life. But for me, I love that. And I think that's all really important. But for me, the other aspect is really part of deprogramming is doing the opposite that you would usually do, right? So let's say when you're really self-critical, maybe you go and like work even harder or go do something else that's just more depleting. But in that moment, instead of asking, am I good enough? Which, by the way, 80% of millennials endorse the idea I am not good enough with regards to almost every aspect of their life, which is tragic when you think about it. And self-criticism is basically asking, am I good enough, right? Am I good enough? I'm not good enough. But self-compassion asks, what's good for me? What's good for me right now? And maybe what you need in that moment is something soothing. Maybe you need a nap. Maybe you need to take a break. Maybe you need to have some food, do something that puts you back in that more calming parasympathetic state.
And so let's come back to the example that you had given. You're at the park, you're with your children an hour away, you're, the keynote or the event producers ask you, are you having trouble logging in? How in that moment, maybe you did that, or maybe if you had an opportunity for a redo, what would be something that would be nourishing for you in that moment where you're asking the question, what's good for me right now? You have this stark shame and, oh my God, how did I forget? It's a Saturday. What do you do for yourself in that moment?
Yeah. Well, I know that morning I went home, had some food, recorded a talk and sent it to them and asked for it to be pro bono. And then I think I took a nap. That's what I needed. My nervous system had had such a stress experience, right? And that's what I needed.
Wonderful. So what we want to be thinking about is how can we bring ourselves into parasympathetics? Because what's going to happen in that moment is probably the sympathetic system, as you mentioned, is going to get jacked. Yeah. Cortisol, all the catecholamines, everything's running on high octane, but we want to try to bring ourselves back into more of a relaxed state. And I would actually say that that's true even in arguments. One of the things that I'm, my son's going to kill me for mentioning this, but, we're working on, like sometimes there's drama at school or, drama with his brother, whatever. And so we're really coaching him to say, okay, before you respond, can you just take a breath? And really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put some space between the primitive reaction that he wants to have, which is like punching his brother or, doing whatever, and thinking about, hey, what's the best, like trying to get his frontal lobe back online. Because I think that when we are in that shame, so like the event producers say, where are you? You're like, oh my God, and then like the frontal lobe literally shuts off. You're just in survival mode. And then you can, in those times, I think that's really when a lot of the mistakes are made. Like, you misstep, you say things you shouldn't, you do things that you shouldn't. In my son's case, like he's punching his brother when he shouldn't, or whatever. Or even if I'm in a conflict, let's say I'm in a conflict with my husband or a friend or a family member, you say things that you shouldn't in that moment because you're not quite centered.
Right.
So I think it is very valuable, just to sort of underline what you're saying, is to just put a little bit of space, however that is, taking a nap, eating some food, between the stimulus and the response.
That's right. That's right. And we've conducted quite a bit of research on the impact of breathing on emotional well-being, mental health, and trauma. And we found that, of all of the interventions we looked at, it was the breathing intervention that had the most powerful results. So I always feel like in a time when we need things to work well, work fast, and we need to be able to, like you said, get our frontal lobe back online, be able to think clearly and rationally again. Breathing practices are the fastest way to do that, undoubtedly.